Hey, Erin, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brittany. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. We're getting bigger and bigger companies on the show, and I just love it. And we are going to discuss a topic that we've brushed upon, but we haven't really deep dived. And it absolutely deserves a deep dive because we're going to get into statistics of prevalence. And I've even been honest on the show previously about my own history of eating disorder. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot personally and putting a spotlight on something that affects so many women.
Fantastic. I'm so excited to be here. And I think eating disorders is an area that is full of stereotypes and myths. So excited to dive into those with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, first, where are you calling us from today?
I live in Carlsbad, California. So it's a community just north of San Diego, but I'm originally from Minnesota. So I'm still pinching myself that I am living in a place that not only doesn't snow, but doesn't have snow for 8 months of the year.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's a big change.
Huge change.
Erin, we love to learn a little bit more about our guests before we dive into the topic of the interview. So tell us a little bit more about, your upbringing, and did you go to school? You do have a Ph.D. So were you always intending in going into women's health and eating disorders, or what was your trajectory? Kind of bring us along your story.
Yeah, so I grew up in Minnesota. I'm the oldest of 3 kids. I'm very close to my siblings and my parents. And I developed an eating disorder when I was in 5th grade, I think 10 years old, and was fortunate to recover. My parents were very active in my treatment and in many ways took over treatment. So this was in the 90s, or like maybe 1990. And we didn't have family-based treatment, the evidence-based treatment for eating disorders yet. And so my parents had taken me to a dietitian and a therapist and a psychiatrist, and they were always kicked out of the session. So they continued to take me, but they also just took matters into their own hands and brought me to recovery. I really didn't think about eating disorders very much after that. I was really interested in writing. I was interested in science and health. But my family was also all in the retail space and the business world. So I was also really interested in those things. I went to college at Northwestern University and I was pre-med, but also studied French and communications and international studies. I'm just someone who's interested in a lot of things. My first job after college was actually marketing Broadway shows while they toured. So very different than what I do today.
I love it. Yeah.
I was excited. I was in charge of vagina monologues and cabaret. And it was a lot of fun, though I had like the very tertiary market. So like Missoula, Montana, Hagerstown, Maryland, Columbus, Missouri. And I loved the plays, but I didn't really like the job. And I started taking night courses just as a way to meet people and do things, and really fell in love with neuropsychology and ended up getting a job in Washington, D.C. at the NIH as a research assistant in a neuroimaging lab. And I will always remember that interview because they're saying, explain to me how this Broadway job is preparing you for this job doing neuroimaging research. And I said, I don't know, but I learn really fast. And I have a feeling that theater and academia aren't that different, except for maybe no jazz hands. And that got me the job. They took a chance on me. I absolutely loved neuroimaging research. I studied how the brain was organized and how it reorganized as a result of seizures or strokes in early childhood. And I had always known with every fiber of my being that I wanted to be a parent. And there were some studies that said that the best jobs for working parents were being an academic researcher. I'm like, okay, this is what I'll do. That's what brought me out to San Diego to get my Ph.D. And then in the late 2000, 2008, when the recession happened, funding cycles also changed. And I didn't know if I wanted to be writing research grants and if it was going to be that great of a livelihood. I went and did my residency year in San Francisco, had a lot of great clinical experience, had my first child, and ended up off cycle for fellowship. And so I called my grad school friends and said, do you know anyone who's hiring fellows off cycle? It can be really hard to get back on the fellowship cycle. And they said, the Eating Disorder Center is. I'm like, oh, I don't know if I really want to work in eating disorders. And I haven't thought about eating disorders for about 20 years. It wasn't a part of my training, wasn't part of my life. But I am so fortunate that I took that fellowship at the UC San Diego Eating Disorder Center, because it clearly changed the trajectory of my life.
That's an amazing story. I love it. And I can't help but think vagina monologue somehow has actually been full circle here.
Exactly. Yes.
So let's get into it. What is Equip Health?
Yeah, so Equip is a fully virtual treatment provider for eating disorders. And I think it helps to, as you can tell by my very long intro, I often like to start with the dinosaurs. So like, what are eating disorders? Eating disorders are an umbrella term. There's actually 7 different diagnoses that go under that umbrella.
7,
they affect
okay.
kids. Yeah, they affect kids as young as 5. They affect adults into their 90s. And one of the things my co-founder, Christina, and I noticed, and this is true in lots of areas of mental health, that the treatment that you got so wildly varied depending upon which provider you went to and which community you lived in. And a lot of people don't know what's going on behind the closed doors of a therapy room. And we wanted to make sure that more people had access to evidence-based and evidence-informed treatment for eating disorders. So we started Equip. Families join us and they get a 5-person fully virtual treatment team. So they get their medical provider, like a pediatrician, a psychiatrist to prescribe medication. They get a dietitian, they get a therapist, both family and individual. They get a peer mentor, that's someone who's in recovery themselves from an eating disorder, and they get a family mentor, that's someone who's helped their loved one through an eating disorder. And this 5-person treatment team will meet with you as often as you need, and also has between session messaging to help bring you to full recovery.
Wow. And how established is Equip?
I like to say we're starting elementary school. Is how I say it. So in the startup space, things have been moving really fast. We incorporated in December of 2019. We spent 2020 building our clinical model and running some beta trials, which we've since published in peer-reviewed journals. And then in 2021, we started seeing our first patients and turned on our first payer contracts. So we're now in network with 11 or 12 different insurance providers and serving people in all 50 states.
Amazing. That is fast, but it also is telling of how important this is and how needed it is, right? So I'm excited for us to get into that. Let's start with, you were talking about 7 different types of eating disorders. What are the 7 different types?
Yes, so the main ones that most people have heard of are anorexia and bulimia. So anorexia nervosa is when you end up with a caloric deficit. You're not consuming enough calories for how many calories your body needs to function and survive every day. I think a lot of people assume that these are people who are intentionally dieting or intentionally starving themselves to look like an Instagram model. But in fact, people with anorexia look lots of different ways. First, not everybody with anorexia appears to be underweight. Also, about 40% of sufferers are males. I've treated Afghanistan vets who had no intention of developing anorexia, but they went to Afghanistan, they had 80 pounds on their back, they are running around in the sand, and they just were burning so many more calories than they were consuming, and they ended up in a caloric deficit. So sometimes just the act of being in a starvation state induces the eating disorder. So that's anorexia. There's bulimia or bulimia nervosa. That is when people have binge eating episodes where they eat more at once than they intend to or feel comfortable, and then they follow that with a purge. It's most often vomiting, but sometimes it's excessive exercising, or sometimes it's using laxatives. I think something that's important to remember, though, is that in bulimia, people also struggle with restricting, where they don't eat often for 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, and then their body is understandably so hungry that then they have a binge episode. The newest diagnosis on the block is ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. This is when we should make fun of psychologists for making everything acronyms that still don't make it clear what it means. But I think the best way to say it is like picky eating gone awry. So these are often illnesses that start in childhood or toddlerhood, and they're either extreme picky eating. So we meet kids that are 11 and only eat 5 foods. But there's also some kids with ARFID who just have very, very low hunger cues. So they're the kids that after they take 1 or 2 bites, they're like, my tummy hurts and I don't want any more. And so these kids tend to not lose weight. However, they stop gaining weight. So at the age of 10, they weigh the same as when they were 6. So those are the 3 eating disorders that we treat most often right now at Equip, because we're serving kids ages 6 to 24. There's also binge eating disorder, which is the same usually restriction and binge cycle that we see in bulimia, just without the compensatory behaviors afterwards. There's the catch-all OSFED, and then there's pica or pica and rumination, which are less frequent eating disorders.
Wow. How prevalent are eating disorders? How many people are affected in the United States and in the world, if you have that?
Yeah, so eating disorders are much more prevalent than people realize. They'll affect nearly 30 million Americans in their lifetime. However, only about 20% of those struggling will ever receive treatment. If you are a cisgendered female, thin, white, young, between the ages of 15 and 25, you might get diagnosed, and you probably would get diagnosed at least 3 years after your illness starts. But if you don't meet that stereotype, which is most people with eating disorders, you're less likely to get diagnosed. But it happens in same prevalence rates across all ethnicities, races, socioeconomic levels.
Wow. And does it disproportionately affect women?
There's a disproportionate amount of people diagnosed that are women. You're just significantly more likely to get diagnosed if you're a female or if you're cis female. But we know that it affects the transgender population at a rate that's about 5x the cisgender population. So trans female and trans male and non-binary individuals are more likely to develop eating disorders. Males, we think about 40% of people with eating disorders are cisgender male.
Wow. Well, it's very interesting. We've had an episode before on concussions, and we started the episode about women have more concussions in sports than men, but at the end of the interview we were like, oh, wait a minute, you mean that society just allows women to get their heads checked, like rather than a male athlete who's told to get it back on the field, unless your femur's broken in half, like you're not sick, you're a man, get back out there, right? And so it's actually a gender societal issue rather than a biological one. And so for eating disorders, my question is there an actual like sex X and Y chromosome implication here that is, 2 X's make you more, likely to have this, or is this more of a society driven disease? Or let's kind of tease that apart. Where does gender and biology and this eating disorder intersect?
That's an outstanding question. So we do not feel like we haven't found any biological X versus Y chromosomal aspect to eating disorders. However, there does seem to be a hormonal effect to it. So we see the onset of eating disorders around puberty more in both males and females. So, and in non-binary individuals as well. So there's something about a hormonal change that might have an effect. We also talk about them being brain-based illnesses, and this is where my neuroimaging background really gets to kind of geek out, that we found that the brains of people who've had eating disorders, either they have them right now today or they had them 30 years ago, there's aspects of their temperament that are wired differently in their brain. And that seems to be the difference. And that can be in a male brain or a female brain or a non-binary brain. But an example of what we see in our adjacent to our insula, in our parietal lobe, we've got the reward circuitry and the consequence circuitry. And those really run in parallel. And I like to, this is an example that my mentor, Dr. Walt Kay, would give of a bunny. So just imagine that you're a bunny, and we're not all that different than other mammals. And you are hungry. And so your reward circuitry starts firing, carrot, carrot, carrot. So you go out into the field and you're looking for carrots, you're motivated by carrots. And then all of a sudden you see a fox. And your reward circuitry should get paused, and your consequence circuitry should start firing and say, get away from the fox. Because if all you're thinking about is carrots, 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 you're going to get eaten. So you run back to your little bunny hole. Now, if your consequence circuitry doesn't stop firing, you're so afraid of the fox, you never leave your bunny hole and you die of starvation. So in order to survive, you need to have both the reward and the consequence circuitry being salient and firing at the right time. What we see in people who have had eating disorders, whether they currently have it or long recovered, is that consequences tend to be more salient than rewards. So for anyone who's brought their teenager to eating disorder treatment, we've had people say, I'll buy you a puppy if you gain 10 pounds. I will, sometimes we hear extreme things like, I'll buy you a car if you gain 15 pounds. And they won't do it because those rewards aren't salient. But the imagined consequence of gaining weight, the imagined consequence of looking different feels so much greater and bigger than any reward can, if that circuitry's off. So that's just one example of how eating disorders are truly wired in the brain, and that all of us are exposed to this very gross, fat-phobic, diet-centric culture, but only about 5 to 10% of us are going to develop eating disorders. If it were just about our culture, we'd all have them. But if your brain's not wired for it, you might not get one.
Wow. And so this looming fox outside of the hole that people with eating disorders are so worried about, right? That they don't even go out to eat the carrot. I love this analogy. I love metaphors. This is great. What is the fox to somebody with an eating disorder? Like, what are they afraid of, and obviously it can be different, right? Because it's, binging, the consequence is different than the anorexia, right? Because the binger will actually go out and maybe hoard all the carrots, versus the anorexic person, I'm not leaving at all. So like, what is the fox to them? What are we worried about?
That's an excellent question. And there's some people in the field who think that maybe these eating disorders aren't similar at all, that maybe anorexia and binge eating disorder, they're only lumped together because they both happen to contain food, but maybe it's very different neurobiological mechanisms underneath them. So for people with anorexia, sometimes it is body changes. Also, sometimes also for kids with ARFID, it's body sensation. I'm going to vomit. I'm going to feel full. I'm going to feel uncomfortable. Sometimes that's the fox. What we see sometimes with bulimia and binge eating disorder, and also anorexia binge purge type, is that eating disorder behaviors serve a purpose. So I like to talk about how it seems as though people with eating disorders, particularly binge eating disorder, bulimia, and anorexia binge purge type, have this tremendous capacity to feel. And the fox for them is losing control of their emotions and doing something that they're going to regret. So what we see is, and I've worked with some delightful teenagers, one in particular who explained this to me so well. She's like, listen, I was walking down the hallway at school. This girl, Sarah, walked by me and she gave me this look. And like, she's kind of my friend. She's like, so I spent the next 5 hours ruminating, like, did I talk about Sarah to someone? Did I do something wrong? She's like, I felt guilty. I felt worried. I felt sad. She's like, but I felt 10 out of 10 guilty and 10 out of 10 sad. She's like, I know that if that exact same thing had happened to my friend Megan, she might have been like, well, Sarah's in a bad mood. Or maybe she did feel like, did I gossip about her? But she would be like 2 out of 10 anxious. And so we see that a lot in eating disorders, that the volume of emotions is louder and it's hard to sustain that. So if you cut yourself, you'll feel better. If you binge, you'll feel better. If you vomit, you'll feel better. If you drink alcohol, you'll feel better. So sometimes the eating disorder symptoms are just like lots of other, or not, the eating disorder behaviors are like just a lot of other behaviors that you can use to help change your emotions.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've shared on the show before, I'm in recovery for bulimia, and it's exactly that. It's a sense of, if I can hurt myself, at least I'm in control of that pain, versus the external pain I can't control. And if I hurt myself, the follow-up feeling is usually numbness, and that's the gold standard. Like, that's what I want, right? And so for me and my story, it was absolutely a disorder of wanting control because my childhood was so out of control. I've heard that the chances of developing an eating disorder are way higher in survivors of sexual abuse. Is that true, or is that just something I've heard?
It is something you've heard. No, it's definitely out there. And I mean, like everything in academia, it's something that's a bit debated, like chicken and egg, right? Yeah. So do people who have eating disorders and who are wired to feel things a certain way, are they more prone to end up experiencing trauma or experiencing PTSD? But we know there's definitely a relationship, and we don't know exactly the direction it goes. In people over the age of 18 who have an eating disorder, 50% of them also have meet criteria for PTSD symptoms.
Yeah, so interesting. And what is the history of eating disorders? Is this something that's been with us since like Roman times, or is this like a 21st century issue?
been around forever. There's some really old writings that talked about how, well, if starving yourself for God, right? Fasting.
Oh, that's right.
If starving yourself, so fasting
literally
for God.
fasting, like, oh, fuck,
Yeah,
the Bible, yeah.
So if fasting for God for one day is good, then surely fasting for God for 3 days is better. And so we see early examples of eating disorders, from the very, very beginning, and the Bible is full of it.
Wow, that's quite remarkable. What are the current, treatments available? For myself, it was my own mental health journey. Like, as I addressed my own PTSD, the eating disorder kind of steadily improved as well. I was also a member of Overeaters Anonymous, which one might not think that's a program for people who undereat, but it was a amazing program. I cannot speak more highly of it. If you are a listener thinking you need some support around food, OA is a beautiful, beautiful program that welcomed me with open arms. And, it was an interesting paradox of people in those meetings where their program was a death sentence to me, and my program was a death sentence to them, because there was women in that room who could not eat sugar. Like, sugar was their heroin, right? And so they were on really strict diets. And I was like, strict diets is literally why I'm here. My program was like, eat the cupcake, girl, eat it and enjoy it and like sit with it, And so it was like really different and interesting. But so just a little shout out to that amazing program, life-saving program. What are the other treatments available?
Yeah, so the treatments have been very, it sounds like this might have been true for you too. You had to go out there and put together your own puzzle of treatment. You had to kind of find stuff yourself. It's not like there's one treatment that's prescribed to everyone.
Well, considering I fought the diagnosis for about like 8 years, like the first time someone told me versus the last time somebody diagnosed me where I actually believed them and said, okay, maybe you're right. Like I used to say like, oh, I don't have an eating disorder. I just have disordered eating.
I think a lot of people, I think a lot of people listening to this can relate to it. And I think we hear that a lot when someone if you aren't a 15 to 25-year-old emaciated thin white girl, you say I have disordered eating. Yeah. And being in the startup space, I wasn't sure how the finance bros would take to us pitching an eating disorder company. And what we found is we could not leave a single pitch without someone later saying to us, so yeah, I'm a 40-year-old finance bro and I've been vomiting 3 times a day and I have no idea where to go get help, or this is my son, this is my daughter, this is my nephew. It truly affects everyone. So what does treatment look like? Treatment's just been really inaccessible. This goes to your earlier point about, well, it might not be gendered and who gets it. What is gendered and how? I believe that because this is an illness that we think of as a female illness, it's contributed to it being very underfunded and to it being misrepresented as an illness of man.
Yep. Well, that's like the tagline of FemTech, isn't it? If it only affects women, it's underfunded and not served, which is like.
Exactly. And not taken seriously. And so eating disorders are underfunded in every way one can be underfunded. So philanthropically, it raises the least amount per patient of any other mental illness. But also when you look at NIH and research dollars, it's less than $1 per patient of research dollars compared to $75 per patient for the next least funded mental health disorder. Okay, so let's say you do get funded to do eating disorder research though. The least amount of pages of peer-reviewed journals are dedicated to eating disorder research. It's significantly harder to get an eating disorder research article published than any other type of mental health article. And these are not my own original ideas. This has all been published and documented. So this is just a very misunderstood place. And so then this is what has also led to people not knowing how or where to get treatment. And you end up even in like whisper networks, like, do you know anybody? Do you know anybody? It's not like you can Google and just find the right thing. So there are evidence-based treatments for eating disorders, and they've largely been stuck in academia. A lot of people go to wonderful therapists who practice what's called eclectic treatment, which is the treatment that worked for them or the treatment that they've seen worked for a patient. And it's well-intentioned, but I think one of the problems we have in the entire mental health space, but definitely for eating disorders, is that when people don't get better, they don't blame their really nice therapist, or they don't blame the modality of treatment that the therapist gave them. They blame themselves. I'm too broken. My PTSD is too severe. My eating disorder is too bad. When really, maybe they've just never been given evidence-based treatment.
Wow, that is fascinating. What are the consequences of untreated eating disorders? I mean, I guess it's a consequence of an eating disorder in general, but what are the consequences?
Yeah, if you don't get treatment for an eating disorder, if you've been ill for at least 3 years, your chances of having a relapsing, remitting course of treatment or life significantly increases. So the longer you're ill, the less likely you are to ever experience full recovery. Additionally, I've never met someone with just an eating disorder. Usually people also have anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, and after the age of 18, 50% of people with eating disorders also struggle with substance use disorder. So the longer you go untreated, the less likely you are certainly to recover from your eating disorder, but also you're less likely to recover from your other comorbidities. It's not possible to get sober but keep your eating disorder, because your eating disorder is going to trigger your substance use to come back.
Wow.
Or it's not possible to recover from your PTSD but not deal with your eating disorder, because the eating disorder will trigger the PTSD to come back. So there's a lot of consequences of it, and it's really unfortunate that we don't hold providers to a higher standard and that we blame ourselves when we don't get better, instead of looking like maybe that treatment didn't work. And I like to compare it to the medical field. Like if you went to a dermatologist for a rash and your rash didn't get better, you'd think maybe it's the cream and they need to prescribe me a different cream for it, or maybe it's the dermatologist and I need a second opinion. But we don't do that in the mental health field. When we don't get better, we go back to the same treatment center again and again, the same person again and again. And maybe they're just really nice, but not providing evidence-based treatment.
Right. Well, I mean, it's, and again, I'm speaking for myself here, that eating disorder was very much a self-punishment disorder. And so to think about who's deserving of the punishment if it doesn't work. I mean, this whole thing is based on me not liking myself, or me upset with my body for reminding me of stuff, or my body, having feelings and me wanting to numb that. And so that's not surprising that the consequence would be, oh, my fault. Interesting.
And when you think of an illness that people perceive as only affecting females, well, then of course it's the female's fault when they don't get better, right? There's a lot there.
We're definitely kind of debunking some of this gender stuff. I had no idea, even personally, how many men are affected by this. And so this is really fascinating. How has the pandemic affected eating disorders? You started this in December 2019. You probably had no idea what you were in store for. None of us did. And it sounds like you really got so much traction during the pandemic. And maybe that would have happened regardless, but how has the pandemic affected eating disorders?
The pandemic has been awful for so many people in so many ways, but we've definitely seen about a 70% increase in eating disorders, which is unheard of. We're seeing.
Let me just reiterate that. 70% that's statistically significant. I haven't seen the data, but it sounds significant.
Well, and I would have never predicted that. Eating disorders is something that has been pretty steady for thousands of years, right? So, or hundreds of years, the rates of people with eating disorders. And people are like, oh, surely it's gotten worse because of, magazines that are airbrushed. And we're like, it's always been kind of bad. And if it were just about wanting to look different, then maybe magazines would have changed it, but no. But I think the pandemic created a perfect storm. So one, it created a lot of emotions and not a lot of way to handle the emotions. So being with peers, socializing, getting to go to soccer practice. There's lots of things that we do that give us a life worth living and that help to contribute to our emotion regulation. And a lot of those things were taken away. So there were a lot of people who tried to regulate their emotions by restricting, by binging, by vomiting, because as you said, vomiting numbs you out quick. It is a very effective way to regulate your emotion. Not a long-term effective way, but certainly a short-term effective way. So I think that's one of the reasons we saw an increase in eating disorders. I think the second reason is the increased rate or the increased amount of social media that people were consuming during this time. So it is simplistic to say that social media causes eating disorders. We don't have data to suggest that, but we do know that social media can be very triggering. And people have asked me okay, Erin, in the 90s, I remember reading, 17 magazine and people were airbrushed and I wanted to look like them. Like that was bad for us. Isn't social media the same? And yes, it is something, but it is the quantity. The time it took us to flip through a magazine, when you probably see about 100x, 1000x number of images when scrolling through your feeds. Your brain is just getting bombarded with more and more unrealistic images. And we all spent more time on our phones and on screens during the pandemic. And then lastly, I think another thing that happened is families were with their children more and got to see behaviors that before were probably hidden. They were hidden because they were at school. They were hidden because they were at soccer practice. And so I think parents got to see the full spectrum of how their children were interacting with food, interacting with exercise, and interacting with their emotions.
Do you notice, and I have a few additional questions, but like, do you notice that typically families are supportive? I mean, that's part of your treatment, is like one of the pegs in your wheel is the family. Personally, my mom, one of the last times I was diagnosed officially, my mom was in the room and she said, no, I've watched her eat. She eats fine. That's not what it is. Like very blatant denial, which is classic my mom. And so, do you find that it's an often issue where families are not supportive or won't acknowledge, or am I like I don't know. I guess I'm asking in general.
You're not an anomaly. And I would say that any type of family you can imagine is a type of family that we've treated. It doesn't seem as though family factors into whether or not you get an eating disorder, with the exception of there does seem to be passing of these genetic temperament traits from parent to offspring. So maybe one of the parents has trouble regulating their emotions, and so does their kids. Or maybe one of the parents is very perfectionistic, and so is their children. But we see all types of families. And when we go to treat people from this family perspective, and we do this whether you're 10, and we also recommend it if you're 30 or 40. And it's about the fact that you can't recover on your own. So eating disorders are what we call egosyntonic, just like a fancy psych word, which means that if you're anxious, you want to stop being anxious. If you're depressed, you want to stop being depressed. But there's something about an eating disorder that people aren't entirely sure if they want to get rid of their eating disorder. There's a part of it that they don't like, but there's a part of it that provides them with a way to regulate their emotions, a way to provide them comfort, a way to regulate their weight. And so a lot of ambivalence comes with eating disorders. Additionally, in order to recover from an eating disorder, you typically have to eat about at minimum 3, but usually 6 times a day. So whether you have bulimia or binge eating disorder or anorexia, the medicine really is frequently eating. Don't let yourself get so hungry that you have a binge, but also don't restrict. Make sure you're getting all the calories that your body needs. You have anorexia or ARFID. Now, your brain doesn't want you to eat. Some people who don't have hunger cues, you're not even hungry. My co-founder often says, it's almost cruel to ask someone to do that by themselves. Yeah. And so you need your family, but truly family is whatever family means to you. So while we definitely have families that are like a biological mom and a biological dad helping their biological child to get better, we have lots of parents and step parents and aunts and grandparents and a theater teacher and a neighbor, whoever is going to be the people that are going to help structure your home environment for pro-health behavior. So I'll do one more. Go ahead. Yeah, one more kind of analogy is like if you were struggling with substance use, you would expect your significant other, your roommate, your parents to maybe get rid of the alcohol in the house to make it difficult for you to act on your urge. We're asking the same thing of families with eating disorder treatment. So let's say your child has a hard time, they have the urge to purge, they have an urge to vomit after a meal. So then we say, okay, family, let's just acknowledge that this is something that's difficult for Brittany. She's going to want to vomit after this meal. So we're going to make it a family rule that after dinner, you can have unlimited screen time, but you need to be where I can see you. No taking a shower after dinner, no being alone in your room after dinner. Maybe we do a family walk. Maybe you go hang out with your friends. Maybe you get to play video games during dinner even, anything to make it easier. And so you ask the family to structure the home for pro-health behavior.
I love that. And because It's absolutely a unit, a family unit thing. I'm dating an amazing partner who, I gained some weight during the pandemic. For me, the biggest thing was being stationary. I was just stuck indoors. I just literally, my step count was 10. Like, I didn't go anywhere, and I gained some weight, and I've, been trying to lose it in a way that is healthy and slow and not crazy. And, and I have this amazing partner who would sometimes hear me feeling discouraged, and he'd say, well, babe, just eat less, skip a meal. And I'd be like, you cannot say that to me. That is literally I know that you're just like thinking off the cuff, oh, just like cut your calories. Like, to me, that's like you telling me to just cut off your breast. Like, I don't know, like, so crazy. No. And so, I gave him a blog with like top 10 things not to say to someone with the eating disorder. And he was like, oops, I've been saying 8 of the 10. Like, is there anyone listening to the show where can they go to Equip Health? Like, and is there blogs, is there resources there? Like, what can somebody listening who wants to support someone do?
Yes. So, our website is www.equip.health. And there's plenty of like articles and what to say and what not to say. But then also, let's say, your loved one is at Equip and your loved one is 42 years old. We encourage you to come as well, and also give you groups and resources to be with other significant others, people going through treatment. Because it can be very hard for us to, when you're trying to get better, to also have to advocate for yourself can be just a whole nother layer of work to do. And so instead of you having to tell your significant other, please don't say that, say this instead, let's just give them a group with a whole bunch of other significant others who can talk about how to best support someone.
By the way, update y'all, he's doing amazing and not saying any of those 10 things anymore. He just needed like some direction, right? He's like really awesome. So we're doing great. But
and it makes sense that he was saying that though, because our whole culture is saying things like that, right? So he was being normal, but hopefully we can change what normal is, and also maybe we can not lose the weight after the pandemic. Maybe that's the weight our body wants to be.
Yes. This has literally been so fascinating. I want to talk to you forever and ever. But alas, we are an episode-based podcast, and so we have to wrap it up. But we have 2 last questions that our listeners really love. The first one is, we have a lot of students and aspiring entrepreneurs that listen. So what's an area in women's health and wellness that you think still needs innovating?
Oh my, all of it. Okay. What is an area of women's health? Well, eating disorders still need innovating. I know that's kind of a cheap answer to say my own area.
Oh, no, absolutely. It's your passion. Tell me, is there other tech companies like Equip, or are y'all like the one company out there?
We're kind of it. It was interesting while we were fundraising, people are like, I think I've heard, 100 substance use startups in the past 2 months. And this is like only eating disorder one I've ever heard. So just getting people to think more broadly about what eating disorders are, who they affect. And I would love for people to help just work on this concept of treatment that feels good isn't the same as treatment that works, and helping us to be more discerning around mental health treatment in general, and making sure that we don't think of illnesses as just female illnesses. I have to admit, I kind of even hate myself for saying it, like, oh, in order to get more people to care, let's think about it as a men's illness too. I would like us to also just care about women. Anyway,
but I also hear you. I hear you. That's what we do in FemTech. Like, uterine fibroid grant was funded by the US government because we told them female soldiers with uterine fibroids wouldn't be able to fight. And like, that was the only reason we could get that grant approved. Was because women in the front lines need to be able to hold their guns up without cramps, and like, I hate that. Why can't we just say women in everyday life are having cramps? And it's like, nope, we have to make some kind of weird argument to suffice other things that we prioritize.
Yeah. And I'd love people to also think about, there is a difference between an eating disorder and disordered eating. And most people in our culture hate their body, whether they're female, male, or non-binary. That's not great either. It doesn't need to be an eating disorder for us to want to change it. And so for people to be more critical of, I'm doing air quotes for those listening, the wellness culture that's going on right now, it is really targeting women, targeting women's dollars. Women are spending so much money on wellness culture. And what are the ways in which it's actually really bad for women?
I have, working in the FemTech space, I do see companies. We've had some on the show, and I love most of them. But there is also like a line where I'm like, okay, is this just a dieting app? Like, is this another way to get, I can't fathom the percentage of your consumers that actually need medical care versus a subscription to your weekly blog. Like, I think they may need to read less about how long to fast to lose weight, and more about how do you breathe and center yourself before a meal so you're not in fight or flight, right? Like, just thinking about things differently. So our last question is, what do you think the femtech industry as a whole needs the most right now in order to be successful?
Yes, I think it's speaking mainly to females with what I want to answer here. And it's a little bit to spend less time in school and go do the work. I've met so many females who feel like they need to get all of the degrees. And obviously I'm like speaking to the choir here with Brittany and I.
I'm like over here
I
in
can't,
Ph.D. by 24.
Yeah.
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 What kind of disordered living was I having? Yeah, we can also put a pin in that, but.
Yes. And I think that's one of the things that blew me away about my co-founder. So she is 29, she'll turn 30 this year. And she also a couple of years ago felt like, well, in order to make a difference in eating disorders, I have to first get my MD or first get my PhD. And her and I talked a lot about that. There's a lot of ways to make change in the world, which isn't becoming an expert first. You can be an expert without all the degrees after your name. Like, go and get into the field. And I think there's so many smart women who are spending 15 plus years getting an education when, like, no, go do that startup right now. Go insert yourself into these other fields and ask for these leadership positions. We don't need to spend all this time getting these degrees. I know that we just spent, you and I, a lot of time getting them. So I'm coming from a place of privilege in saying that, but don't feel like you need to get these letters after your name in order to make a difference.
Well, I think that's a really relevant comment when we're thinking about femtech and how many people are currently looking for roles in women's health and how many people are hiring in women's health. We just had a very successful jobs fair with over 500 candidates, like really, really exciting time. But a lot of people have been asking me, I don't have a degree in women's health. And I'm like, I'm not sure how you could, unless you're an OB-GYN, like, and even they don't know about the innovation in women's health. They just know where the fallopian tubes are, right? Like, so, and not to dismiss what OB-GYNs know, we all know we're a big fan of them, but, there is actually no degree in femtech. And in fact, if you want to be known in femtech, just start something. Yeah. I have like an honorary PhD in femtech because of how many interviews I've done. But it's just because I was the first FemTech podcast to get started. And so, like, if you listeners want to do something, want to be known in women's health, start a meetup group, for a book club or a movie night series for women's health, or start a local chapter. We're starting to, get back into the real world, to like build whatever city you're in, make a meetup where once a week you guys get together, you bring in a speaker, like it so quickly can become the number one. Like, yeah. I'm actually personally appalled that I'm like a global thought leader, like a top 10 thought leader in women's health after only 2 years of working in this space, because I'm like, wait, I just spent how many years in genetics and nobody, like, I'm not known in the genetics field whatsoever. And now about women's health, I've been, talk to 100 people, put it on Spotify, you're the world's expert. It's prime for new leaders. So, it's an encouraging comment, start something in women's health, because we need it all. We need all of them.
We need it all. Yeah. And don't just hang out in academia and nonprofit, like go grab some of this money. We need to make sure that we're doing stuff in for-profit too.
Erin, you are incredible. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me, Brittany. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed myself.
Okay, I just ended the audio. So great. I knew it was
Thank you.
Great.
I'm sorry I'm sometimes long-winded.
No, you and I, we jive. It was perfect. It was perfect. This is such an important topic. Honestly, I don't know why I thought like Equip Health was even Maybe, I mean, I think you are as established as I think you are, and you are way more approachable than I thought. I thought you'd be a little bit more corporate, or, you know, like, I'm busy, you know, this is a
wearing my homebody sweatshirt. Like, I brushed my hair with my fingers before the podcast. So, yeah, you can call it approachable or a little sloppy, but I'm somewhere in the middle there.
You're human. You're human. I love it. Yeah. Well, we have one last thing that we like to ask of our guests, and we start every episode with your voice, introducing yourself and saying what FemTech is to you. So the phrase is, hi, I'm Erin Parks, or Dr. Erin Parks, co-founder, COO of Equip Health, and FemTech to me is, and then you give some kind of a statement of what it is to you. Some people go philosophical, like, you know, for you, I could imagine it being like, paying attention to diseases, even if they disproportionately affect women, you know, or something like that. I usually tell people it's something that you probably say all the time. Is
okay.
You know?
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I probably should have prepared this. I'm sure that I was told to and I forgot. Okay. FemTech to me is. Okay, you can say like FemTech to me is honestly a new word that I wish wasn't a new word. It's something.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm ready.
Cool. All right. So I'll just be quiet for a second and give you a little point, and then you go for it. Remember, do your name, your position, your company. FemTech to me is, and then give it. And if you mess up, just laugh and pause and do it again.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dr. Erin Parks. I'm a clinical psychologist and I co-founded Equip Health. I serve as their COO, and we're helping to make sure that everyone has access to eating disorder treatment at work. To me, FemTech is a new word that should not be a new word. I want everyone to know that females deserve to have their voice in the tech space, in the health space, helping to make the world better for everyone.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
It was perfect.
Okay.
Yes. Awesome. So it'll be that, and then the music starts, and then it's, you know, my friend's voice that says, welcome to the FemTech Focus Podcast. And so then we go from there. On Equip Health, is there such thing as a promo code, or is it all insurance based?
It is all insurance based. So we are probably in network with your listeners' payers, or whoever they have for their insurance.
Yeah, because I like to do a call to action in the intro and exit. And so usually with consumer products, or if it's payer, usually we make a promo code, like use FemTech for 15% off or something. But if it's just like go to Equip Health, is that what I should say? What should my call to action be?
I think so. Hannah, help me.
Yeah. I think Brittany, the best thing to do would be to learn more about eating disorder treatment through Equip. Visit, www.equip.health. And then the website has information about, how to join and things like that.
You know what we could do is in the there is a do you have an eating disorder thing on the website? So you might be like,
take the quiz.
Yeah, like if you're one of the people. Yeah, so most people don't self-identify as having an eating disorder, but maybe you have symptoms and you don't realize it. So I'll figure out what would be the best page to send people to. Let's see here.
Erin, is it, I'm going to drop one in the chat. Is it this one?
Is it an eating disorder? Let's see here. Yeah, equip.health/is it an eating disorder?
That one. Right. So I'll also just put that link in the show notes to tell people. Yeah,
that's perfect. Yeah.
Well, I can actually tell you exactly what date your episode is going to drop. If you just give me a second to find which tab it is. And I'll email you the morning of. They drop on Mondays. So I'll email you on the Monday and say, hey, it's live. Here's the link. All right. So yours is going to go out on April 18th.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Yep, April 18th. So I'll email you that morning and say, hey, it's live. Here's the links. Please share it.
How are your preferred ways for us to share? So do you have do you have a Twitter profile you want us to retweet from, or
I mean,
everything?
It's whatever works for you. Some people, your consumers, your audience is wherever they are. Maybe it's in the newsletter, or maybe it's on LinkedIn or whatever. So it's, we're going to share it on all of our social channels. We post it in our virtual community. We, most people are just subscribed to the podcast, so they just listen to the next one, Yeah. So, but feel free to share it, use it however you want. It's your content. And I was going to say one more thing in our last second here. I have a very, very amazing dear friend who would love to work at your company. And
awesome. What do they do?
She does everything. I would say best is like business development and operations. She was working at a like crowdfunding platform that got acquired by Republic. And now she's working at like an accelerator, kind of organizing the mentors and founders and stuff, but she's not like deriving a lot of, she wants to be more impactful. And she's loves your company, and texted me and said, do you know anyone at Equip Health? And I said, well, I'm actually interviewing someone there soon, so I can ask them. So it looks like on your website, you still have a ton of positions, right?
We always do. Just send her to me though, so I can think about where, like I can read her resume, chat with her, figure out.
Amazing. Like, here's her warm recommendation. Like, she's an amazing human who is, I think based on what I know from what our conversation, she would be a great fit, because she's just like a whole amazing woman who wants to make impact. Her husband is like a recovery coach for substance abuse. And so her whole family.
What's her name? So I know to.
Yeah. Alex. Her name is Alex. So Alexandra probably, but Alex Cox-Cusi. Her last name is fun. Cox-Cusi. I put it in the chat.
Fun. Perfect.
I'll just make a warm intro if you don't mind when I hang up. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for thinking of us.
She's gonna be so happy. And I thought, I'm gonna talk to them. And I was like, I hope it's one of those really awesome interviews where we feel like we're friends and I can bring it up. But also if it's very corporate, I'll, try to. But this was great. This is awesome.
Oh, Brittany, this was so much fun. Well, thank you. Yes, send Alex over. And I'm excited to promote the podcast. Thanks for having us on. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, really. You're saving people's lives like my own. So I appreciate what you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you both so much.
You too. Bye.